two people, two different pharmacies. Sometime between 2022 and 2024, both of them hear the exact same sentence: your medication is out of stock. The first has type 2 diabetes. Her doctor prescribed semaglutide years ago to keep her blood sugar from slowly damaging her kidneys, her eyes, her nerves. She's filling a routine monthly refill. The pharmacist tells her it's out of stock. She'll have to call around. The second has obesity, diagnosed by a doctor under the same clinical criteria the FDA uses when it approves the drug for weight management: a body mass index at or above 30, or at or above 27, with an added weight-related condition. He's filling a prescription too. Same active ingredient, a different brand name, a higher weekly dose. His refill is delayed as well. Different boxes, different approved uses. Same molecule, semaglutide, sitting on the FDA's official drug shortage list for nearly 3 years, from March 2022 into February 2025. These two people are a composite, not two traceable individuals, but they stand in for real categories of patients this shortage actually happened to. What follows traces the overlapping decisions and pressures behind it, by a pharmaceutical company, by regulators, and by manufacturing capacity that could not keep pace with demand, not one clean, easily proven chain of cause and effect. So here's the real question underneath this story. It isn't whether the drug works. The clinical evidence for both approved uses is not in serious dispute. The question is this: once one molecule turns out to treat two different, both entirely legitimate medical problems, who decides which patients get to go first? To understand who controls this drug, start with a discovery that was accidental in its origin, but not accidental in its method. In the early 1990s, a researcher at a Veterans Affairs hospital named John Eng was deliberately screening Venom for biologically active compounds, a known, if unglamorous, way to hunt for new drug candidates, since Venoms are evolutionary trial and error factories for potent molecules. In 1992, he isolated a peptide from the venom of the Gila monster, a slow-moving, heavily patterned lizard, native to the deserts of the American Southwest. He published his findings in the Journal of Biological Chemistry and named the peptide Exendin-4. Here is the gap worth noticing. Eng recognized quickly that Exendin-4 looked strikingly similar to a hormone the human gut already produces on its own: GLP-1, the hormone that tells your pancreas to release insulin after a meal. The trouble with human GLP-1 is that it breaks down in the bloodstream within minutes, which makes it nearly useless as an injectable treatment. The lizard's version, for reasons tied to its own venom biology, did not break down the same way. It lasted. A hospital researcher methodically screening Venom for useful compounds had found a longer-lasting blueprint for a hormone the human body was already using to manage blood sugar. That blueprint sat mostly as a laboratory curiosity for years. Then, in 1996, a biotechnology company called Amylin Pharmaceuticals licensed Eng's patent and spent nearly a decade turning the peptide into an actual injectable drug. In 2005, the FDA approved the result: exenatide, sold under the brand name Byetta. It was the first GLP-1 receptor agonist ever approved for use in humans. Notice what that timeline actually says. Novo Nordisk, the company most people associate with this entire story, was not first. It was not close to first. A government hospital researcher, a biotechnology company, and a decade of unglamorous, unromantic drug development got there first, more than a decade before semaglutide would even exist as a product. The object at the center of this story had already changed status once, long before it became famous. It went from venom to isolated peptide to a patented molecule to an entire new drug class that other companies could now enter, provided they could engineer something that worked even better. Novo Nordisk had spent decades as one of the world's dominant insulin manufacturers with a manufacturing scale, regulatory relationships, and sales infrastructure that decades inside that market builds. It did not sit out the drug class amylin and Eng had opened up, but not by rebuilding the Venom peptide. Novo Nordisk engineered its own molecule, a modified version of the human GLP-1 hormone itself, altered to resist the same rapid breakdown, using different chemistry than the lizards. In January 2010, the FDA approved that molecule, liraglutide, under the brand name Victoza, for type 2 diabetes, Novo Nordisk's own entry into the GLP-1 receptor agonist class, 5 years behind Byetta. In December 2014, the FDA approved a second, higher-dose Saxenda brand of that same liraglutide molecule for chronic weight management. One molecule, two brands, two prices, a strategy the company would run again a few years later, on a different molecule entirely. That different molecule was semaglutide, not Xendin 4 rebuilt and not liraglutide either, but a further engineered human GLP-1 analog built to last even longer, a weekly injection instead of liraglutide's daily one. Starting in 2015, 2 years before Ozempic reached pharmacies, Novo Nordisk was already running a dedicated phase 2 obesity trial in people without diabetes, the first step toward a later phase 3 program. Whatever the drug did for diabetes patients, the company was deliberately building a second, separate case for it, using the same brand-splitting playbook it had already run once on liraglutide. In 2017, the FDA approved Novo Nordisk's semaglutide for type 2 diabetes under the brand name Ozempic. It controlled blood sugar well, and weight loss was also observed in trials. Separately, Novo Nordisk continued developing semaglutide for obesity through the clinical program that would later support Wegovy's approval. Novo Nordisk did not need to invent a weight loss drug from scratch, and it did not stumble into one by accident. On June 4, 2021, the FDA approved a second brand, Wegovy, built on the same semaglutide, at a higher weekly dose for chronic weight management in adults with obesity or who were overweight with an additional weight-related condition. It was the product of a clinical development program that began with the 2015 obesity trial and continued through a full phase 3 program, the STEP trials, that generated the evidence the approval rested on. Same drug, two brand names, two doses, two prices, one approved for type 2 diabetes, one approved for a separately recognized chronic disease. Obesity access to that second brand varies with plan design, price, clinical criteria, and utilization management rules. That split is not a footnote to this story. It is the mechanism that made everything that followed possible. Once you have carved two separate products out of one molecule, sold under two names at two price points, you have also built two very different demand curves competing for finite semaglutide supply and manufacturing capacity. Here is where a regulatory decision from 20 years earlier quietly re-enters the story without anyone at the time connecting the two. Until August 1997, federal rules on broadcast drug advertising left almost no practical way to run a normal 30-second prescription drug commercial on television. The standard for presenting a drug's full risk information didn't fit a short broadcast spot. That month, the FDA issued guidance, finalized 2 years later in 1999, clarifying that broadcast ads could satisfy that requirement by directing viewers elsewhere. A phone number, a website, a printed insert for the complete risk information. The guidance did not invent direct-to-consumer drug marketing from nothing, and it did not, by itself, cause anything that happened to Ozempic 25 years later. But it is one of the regulatory preconditions that made the mass-market pharmaceutical advertising environment of the 2020s possible at all. That guidance had been sitting in the background for a quarter of a century. By the time Wegovy reached the market and Ozempic's weight loss reputation started spreading. The spread itself ran through several channels at once, and it is worth being honest about which of them is actually documented. Doctors reportedly writing off-label prescriptions for weight loss. The fill data behind that pattern counts prescriptions filled, not confirmed diagnoses, patients posting before and after photos, and, as one small, well-documented data point among many, Elon Musk replying in October 2022 to a follower who complimented his changed appearance, tweeting that his secret was fasting and Wegovy. Given Musk's reach, Forbes later cited that tweet as a specific, dateable moment when Ozempic and Wegovy's reputation as a celebrity weight loss drug pushed further into public view, describing Ozempic by then as an open secret across Hollywood, an interpretation of the tweet's influence offered by that reporting, not a measured count of who saw it or what they knew beforehand. None of this proves one clean causal line running from a 1997 advertising rule through a 2022 tweet to a later shortage. What's documented is a set of contributing, overlapping conditions, an advertising environment that regulation had made friendlier to drug marketing, a handful of visible public moments, and off-label demand rising on its own, not a single traceable cause. And that overlapping set of pressures was about to push demand beyond available supply and manufacturing capacity. By March 2022, semaglutide products had landed on the FDA's official drug shortage list. Ozempic specifically stayed listed from August 2022 through February 2025, nearly 2.5 years of intermittent, unpredictable scarcity. The FDA itself pointed to a documented surge in semaglutide prescription fills as a factor behind the shortage. A research letter published in JAMA Health Forum put precise numbers on that surge. Combined monthly fills for Ozempic, Wegovy, and Rybelsus rose 442% between January 2021 and December 2023, from 471,876 fills a month to 2,555,308. Ozempic fills rose 392% over that period. Wegovy fills rose more than 1,361% between July 2021 and December 2023. The study can't say, patient by patient, who was filling which prescription or why. It counts fills, not diagnoses. And percentage growth alone doesn't show where the largest absolute increase landed. Wegovy launched from a much smaller base than Ozempic, so a bigger percentage jump there isn't automatically a bigger share of total fills. What the numbers establish is that fills across all three semaglutide brands climbed more than fivefold in 3 years, while demand exceeded available supply and manufacturing capacity. Think about that for a second. That's not gradual growth. That's an explosion the supply chain wasn't built to absorb. Picture what a shortage like that actually meant for someone managing a chronic, progressive disease. Ozempic is not the only glucose-lowering option a doctor can turn to, and a delayed refill does not automatically mean a patient goes untreated. But switching drugs or riding out a gap is a clinical decision made under real pressure, not a costless substitution. And the underlying risk is not hypothetical. Prolonged poor blood sugar control raises the risk of the same slow damage type 2 diabetes has always threatened, to kidneys, to eyes, to nerve endings in the feet. Why does that matter to this story? Because semaglutide didn't arrive in a vacuum. Novo Nordisk had already run a version of this playbook once before on a different chronic disease drug it also happens to dominate. Here's that background, and it has to be handled carefully. This was not the first time Novo Nordisk's pricing behavior around a chronic disease drug had drawn legal scrutiny. Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, and Sanofi are the sole suppliers of insulin in the United States, and by one federal report together account for roughly 90% of the global insulin market. Since 2017, patients and several state attorneys general, including Arkansas, have sued the three companies, alleging they ran what one court filing called an arms race of list price increases on insulin, even as the real net price paid by pharmacy benefit managers reportedly stayed flat or fell. A federal judge allowed the consumer protection law claims to proceed while dismissing separate racketeering claims. Contested allegations, not a proven verdict, and not direct evidence of how Novo Nordisk priced semaglutide, which sits in its own separately defined drug market with its own manufacturers. What this history does establish is that Novo Nordisk was already under serious pricing scrutiny on a different chronic disease drug before semaglutide's shortage and price gap became their own story. And the international price gap tells its own version of the access story, no lawsuit required. U.S. list prices for the identical drugs were dramatically higher than reported prices in other wealthy countries. Those list prices are not the same thing as what every patient paid or what Novo Nordisk received after rebates. Ozempic listed around $969 a month in the United States, compared with about $155 in Canada, $122 in Denmark, Novo Nordisk's own home country, and $59 in Germany, a gap of roughly 16 to 1 against the German price. Wegovy's U.S. list price was roughly $1,349 a month, compared with about $92 in the United Kingdom, a gap of about 15 to 1 by a U.S. Senate committee's accounting. 72% of Novo Nordisk's roughly $50 billion in combined sales from these two drugs came from the United States alone. Same molecule, same manufacturer. What differs between countries is list price, negotiation structure, and rebates, not the underlying manufacturing cost. Price is only half of who gets locked out. Coverage also depends on plan design and formulary decisions made by PBMs, insurers, and employers. A plan may exclude Wegovy, cover it only under defined clinical criteria, or require prior authorization and other utilization management. These rules vary by PBM, employer, plan, and year, so FDA approval alone does not guarantee reimbursement. An individual denial may be reviewed case by case, but the underlying formulary and benefit design are set upstream before the prescription reaches the counter. None of this, the shortage, the price gap, the insulin lawsuits in the background, comes down to one villain making one bad decision in a boardroom. It is a shortage caused by demand that outstripped available supply and manufacturing capacity, layered onto plan-level coverage rules, and layered onto a manufacturer already facing serious, unresolved legal allegations of aggressive list pricing on its other core product line. Several separate pressures stacked on top of each other, all pointing the same direction. Scarcity for some, higher out-of-pocket costs for others. During the same period the shortage was in effect, counterfeit units began appearing inside the legitimate supply chain. Some of them turned out to contain a different drug entirely. Federal law includes a release valve for this kind of situation, though it is more complicated than a simple temporary authorization. While semaglutide products were officially in shortage, qualifying 503A pharmacies and 503B outsourcing facilities could compound semaglutide under different statutory conditions. Shortage status did not erase the other federal and state requirements that applied to them. Their output was not FDA approved, it had not gone through the agency's approval process for safety, effectiveness, and manufacturing quality in the way Ozempic or Wegovy had. What is not legal under any conditions is what showed up alongside it. In December 2023, the FDA identified and seized counterfeit Ozempic pens found inside the legitimate U.S. drug supply chain and published the lot and serial number in a direct consumer warning. The agency said the identity, quality, and safety of the seized product were unconfirmed. 5 adverse events had been reported in connection with the lot, all characterized by the FDA as non-serious. Separately from that specific lot, some counterfeit semaglutide pens analyzed since 2023 were found to contain relabeled insulin glargine, a different injectable drug entirely, and one that sent patients in the United States and abroad to the hospital with hypoglycemia. The FDA later reported additional counterfeit seizures continuing through December 2025. Here is the gap worth sitting with before the story turns toward its ending. During the shortage, qualifying compounders could operate under specific legal conditions. Counterfeiting remained illegal, and separate from that system, the FDA documented counterfeit Ozempic inside the legitimate U.S. supply chain during the same period. But its warning did not establish how far those units traveled, whether patients received them, or whether the shortage or its prices caused their appearance. The object at the center of this story had changed status again, and not for the better. It was no longer only a diabetes drug, or a weight loss drug, or simply an expensive drug. During the same stretch the shortage persisted, it had also become a counterfeiting target, serious enough to trigger repeated FDA seizures and public warnings. That is roughly where the system had landed by 2025. Some patients facing high out-of-pocket costs, some unable to fill prescriptions during the shortage, and an FDA-documented counterfeit risk inside the legitimate supply chain. Something eventually had to give somewhere on the price side. Something did, but only for one specific slice of the people who actually needed it. Go back to that pharmacy counter. Not literally the same two people from the cold open. This part of the story plays out through Medicare, and neither of them may be old enough or otherwise eligible to qualify for it. But picture someone very much like the first patient, a couple of years further on, filling that same monthly prescription under a very different number attached to the price tag. On November 25, 2025, under the Inflation Reduction Act's Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Program, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services finalized negotiated prices for 15 drugs, set to take effect January 1, 2027. CMS treated Ozempic, Rybelsus, and Wegovy, all three Novo Nordisk Semaglutide products, as a single grouped selected drug for negotiation, not as three separately negotiated brand prices. For that group drug, the standardized 30-day negotiated price came to $274, a 71% discount from the roughly $959 2024 list price benchmark CMS used for comparison. CMS's fact sheet also lists package-specific maximum fair price examples within that same group negotiation, about $276.78 for a 4 mg Ozempic pen package and $385.63 for a higher dose Wegovy package. Package-level figures, not a separate Ozempic price versus Wegovy price. Across all 15 drugs in that negotiation round, prices fell somewhere between 38% and 85%. CMS separately modeled what 2024 Medicare spending would have looked like if these negotiated prices had already been in effect that year across all 15 drugs combined. The estimated difference came to roughly $12 billion. That number is a hypothetical comparison against a past year, not a guaranteed future annual savings specific to semaglutide alone. Novo Nordisk's public response was direct and unambiguous. The company said it remained opposed to government price setting on principle and raised what it called serious concerns about the law's broader effect on patients going forward. Consider what Novo Nordisk had built on that molecule. Novo Nordisk traces its corporate roots to two separate Danish insulin companies founded in the 1920s. Nordisk came under a charitable foundation by 1926, and Novo's foundation followed in 1951, established with the stated purpose of ensuring the survival of the company and developing the business optimally, not, as some popular accounts claim, explicitly to block a hostile takeover. And both companies eventually answered to a foundation rather than to individual owners. Those predecessor foundations merged in 1989 into the Novo Nordisk Foundation as it exists today. A foundation with no shareholders, no private owners, and a charter that forbids selling its controlling shares. As of 2024, driven substantially by semaglutide sales. Novo Nordisk's market value passed $570 billion, making it, at that point, Europe's most valuable listed company. a valuation reported at the time as larger than Denmark's entire national economy, and making its foundation by some contemporaneous rankings the largest philanthropic foundation on Earth by assets. A molecule Novo Nordisk had engineered as the latest step in its own GLP-1 program had, within a decade of Ozempic's approval, become large enough for its parent company's market value to be compared to the economy of the country that housed it. Notice exactly what this negotiation changes and what it does not govern. The negotiated prices apply specifically within Medicare beginning in 2027. They do not set prices for working-age adults on private insurance or for people without insurance, nor does this Medicare negotiation by itself erase the broader international list price gap. It changes one defined part of the access system. Not every U.S. payer or patient. A hormone found through deliberate venom research on a desert lizard, refined into the first drug of its kind, by a biotechnology company most people outside diabetes medicine had never heard of, a separate human version of that same hormone class, engineered from scratch by one of the largest drug companies on Earth, rebuilt across a decade into 2, then 3, separate branded products at separate price points. Semaglutide did not ask to become the subject of a national shortage, counterfeit warnings, or a Senate hearing. People did that, one decision at a time. A regulator who issued a narrow piece of advertising guidance in 1997 with no idea what it would help make possible 25 years later. A company that built 2 products out of one molecule at 2 prices, then watched demand for one climb far faster than the other. Insurers and pharmacy benefit managers deciding, plan by plan, who receives reimbursement and who faces more out-of-pocket cost. People producing and distributing counterfeits later found in the legitimate U.S. supply chain. And a Medicare program that negotiated semaglutide's price in its second-ever round of direct drug price negotiations concluded in 2025, but only for the specific patients it already covers. The drug never chose who gets to use it. Everyone standing around it did. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want more stories about the objects, systems, and hidden forces that built the modern world, subscribe to the channel. The next story is already waiting. See you in the next video.